Hi everyone, welcome to the joint CAMBAM QLS seminar talk. For today's speaker, we have a mathematical and neuroscientist with quite a bit of expertise in modeling and applications to neuroscience and developing mathematical theory to basically explain the underlying dynamics of what we see in neurophysiological systems. So our speaker is Daniele Avitabile. He's from, and let me try to pronounce this, Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Did I get that correctly?
Super, super. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, Daniele is. Let me tell you a little bit about his background. He finished his master's at University Sapienza. This is in Rome, Italy, and then his PhD at University of Surrey in the UK. And he traveled quite a bit actually until he settled at Vrije. So initially he was a research fellow at the University of Bristol and then at the University of Surrey, then became an assistant professor at the University of Nottingham, still in the UK, and eventually he moved to the Netherlands to join Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam as an associate professor, and then now he's a full professor. He's going to tell us a little bit about his work in pattern formation, and I'm looking forward to hearing this talk, Daniele. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you all for having me here. It's such a big privilege. So, what I will talk about today is something I got interested at some point, I think a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago. And it has to do with how noise can enhance the formation of patterns, in particular, neuroscience relevance pattern. So if anything else fails in this talk, I think I want you to retain this message. The first message is that everything I'll say has been effectively derived and sparked by James McLaurin at NJIT. James is it's a very talented probability theory. He's one of those non-intimidating probability theories, so he's one of the good ones that could stay with me and teach me something. He has literally taught me everything that has to do with Makin-Vlasov formalism, which is what we're going to be talking about, and he's the driver behind this talk. The second thing I want you to keep in memory, perhaps if everything else fail, is this one that whoops, let me just now I'm starting to fight against my own slides. Yeah. That this spiral, this is like a spiral wave. It's a spiral that is generated by a set of interacting neurons. This spiral is there because of noise. So I just need to take it a little bit more slowly because that might be the most important message of the talk. So let me just rephrase it again. So in here, I have arranged neurons spatially in a hexagon. And I hope that you see for every neuron in every spatial position a little disk. It's completely unimportant that they are on a hexagon. They could be on a disk or on the plane. That's really not important. It's there for reasons that I'll mention perhaps later. And each neuron evolves according to a rate equations. So this is not a complicated Hodgkin-Huxley equation. It's more like a rate equation. Each neuron talks to other neurons through a kernel. So the neurons are interconnected in space. And fundamentally, and very importantly, noise drives the system. In these conditions, I will hopefully I will lead you to find the following conclusions. Without noise, there is no spiral. And with sufficiently high noise, there is spiral. This is somewhat counterintuitive to me because one would imagine if a system can make a pattern, then noise will try to destroy it or let's say disturb it. Whereas in here, it's the opposite situation. If I have no noise, I have no pattern, and the noise is there because of the pattern. The other thing I want to mention is that I very much like being interrupted. So I will just ask for questions and you can just speak up anytime you like. I would very much want to be interrupted by you. So what's the theme of the talk? The theme of the talk is going to be along the following lines. I have a spatial domain D, which I call the cortex, and I want you to visualize this as being a disk. That's going to be my general domain there. And positioned in this cortex, I have neurons. So x sub j is the position of that neuron. And I now want to attach some variables to each of these neurons. These variables depend on time. They turn out to be rate variables, but we're going to discuss that later. Think of them as being, I have, and I attach a set of variables at each position j and at each time t. And I'm now going through one of the golden questions of, I would say, complexity science, but certainly mathematical neuroscience, which is to say, neurons can exist in isolation. By the way, I've lost my chunky patterns all of a sudden, my chunky pointer all of a sudden, I cannot see it anymore. So I beg your pardon, I want to try and, can you see now the chunky pattern? Now I think you see it.
Yes, yes, we can see it.
Yeah, yeah, but somehow, yes, and somehow it disappears now. But anyway, so I don't have a pointer now, but let's say um, the 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 neurons evolve according to their own rule, that is h of uj. There is some form of coupling that I will have to discuss, and then there is noise attached to it. And the questions that we are gonna ask are gonna be what happens as the number of neurons go to infinity. So in here now, there is an underlying n. N is the number of neurons that I have, and the notation is already horrible in this talk. It would be even worse if I annotated n in every place. So you have to keep in mind that the positions, as well as the state variables, they all depend on n, that is the number of neurons. And if I change that, what is going to happen? So as n tends to infinity, what can I say about the behavior of the system? And this is a very well-trodden path where people have studied, much more qualified than me and than us have studied this problem in a very generic setup. The typical formalism that we're going to use is called Makin-Vlasov formalism. And the idea there that has been exploited before in neuroscience is the one to say, I look at neurons as being particles. And in this interaction, and every time there is an exchange between neurons, this is like an interaction particles. And there is a well-defined formalism to do for that. What we do that is not so common in the literature is to instead of taking the most complicated possible model, it's to go the other way around. I want to get the simplest possible model that gives me a tractable mean field limit. So in some sense, I I just don't. It's not. It's well for me. It's more important to say that not only the mean field limit, the n infinite limit exists, but I also want this limit to be simple. And why do I want it to be simple? Because I want to study pattern formation. Remember, I want to study how patterns are impacted by noise, and for that, I need to have a tractable mean field limit. So the h that we pick in this talk, the dynamic that we pick for the variable h, is much, much simpler than you could because we want to negotiate a good, simple tractable limit. Okay, so what is the simplest model that I can think about? So now, if you follow me where there is the parenthesis there, like where there's written minus L of uj, I'm saying that at the level of a single neuron, a neuron in isolation will just decay with a constant L. So if there is no interaction, I just have like a boring decay. And then the interaction through other neurons, like it happens often in neuroscience, happens through this kind of sum over there. So now over there, the terms to keep in mind are the fact that the weights of the matrix scale with n. There is a 1 upon n that you should see there. There is also another little variable that is called phi n, which is there as a sparsity handle. I will discuss that later. It's a sparsity parameter. And then there is the variable f, which is the typical firing rate function. And then each neuron also feels an external input, ij. Remember, J is the position of the J is to do with the jth neuron. And in addition to this, there is also noise, which is the DW part over there. And in the first part of the talk, I have to tell you a little bit what all of this stuff is, because otherwise we're going to get really confused. So the idea is that uj is the state variables of each neuron. We discussed that already. The L is a matrix for local interaction. So over there, I am very quickly swiping under the carpet the fact that in a single neuron, you may have more than one variable. For instance, typically you would have excitatory inhibitory pairs in each node. So for each of these dots J that you have, for each of these red dots, you may have a system of excitatory inhibitory pairs. And that's why in general, uj has q variables in there. And L is not a scalar, it's a matrix, let's say. Then I want to tell you a little bit about the stimulus, I. So remember, up there you should see ij sub t. Where does this come from? Well, it just say I have a function for the stimulus, which is a sign, is given to me. It's continuous in space and in time. And I'm sampling it at the points ij that I want. And then I do something similar with the noise intensity. So the noise intensity G, which appears where the noise is, that also has a spatial and a temporal profile that I'm sampling at selected point in space and at selected time variables. And because I want to make things simple, as I say, this is already a horrible notation as it is. I'm taking Q to be 1, so only one variable per node, just for the sake of it. Now, I will spend a great deal more, a lot more to talk about the interacting part. So I have to tell you something about K and something about N. But if if somehow these terms that I mention here are too abstract, the right framework of mind is the following. I have a network of firing rate neurons. So U is the firing rate associated to the neuron J, and F is the firing rate function. And I have an external forcing, and I have some noise. So you're not far off if you think of this as being a Wilson-Cowan model plus noise. And in here, it's slightly different because in the Wilson-Cowan, you would have a nonlinearity outside of the matrix, and in here you have nonlinearity that multiplies the matrix. Do you have questions for me before I move on? I can't see you very well, so just.
It's all good.
Oh, good. Okay, so something a bit more about the matrix. That is really important now. So when you choose this connectivity, one thing that I often do is to say, oh, I have a spatial function from which the connectivity is taken. So for instance, what I would normally do in a neural field, I would say, I have this kjk is equal to cosine x times cosine y, something like that. In that case, I have a functional form that is deterministic for the matrix K. It's picked up from a function. But in here, the situation is different. In here, I can have that is one option, and it's within the theory that we described. But also, you can have a random connection. So instead of now picking the deterministic function to the kjk to be coming from a function, curly k, I'm saying I extract at random the value of k. The value of that can be either -1 or 0 or 1 with a given probability. So I call this a random ternary coupling because I want to say that at random, some nodes will have excitatory connections, some nodes will have inhibitory connections, and some nodes will have no connections at all. And in addition to that, I have, remember, that term n phi n that normalizes the constant, the incoming neurons there. And the idea behind that is that if I had 1 upon n, typically I would use that for all-to-all connections, whereas in here, I have phi n, which is potentially, how to say, sparsifying parameter. So I can enforce sparsity through phi n. And one thing that is important is that I do not need any assumptions on distance dependence on the kernel. So my kernel doesn't have to depend on the distance between xj and xk. It can be, uh, no, it doesn't have to be like that. Okay, so what are the theoretical results that we have? So the first thing I need to do is I need to tell you in what sense do we take, I mean, the limit as n goes to infinity. And I think this can be best seen if you consider the nodes, just the spatial location of the nodes. So what do I want is I have some nodes that depend on n, and then I want to introduce refinements of these nodes. And the hope is that eventually I cover the entire kind of disk fully. And the right gadget for doing that mathematically is the one of an empirical measure. So the idea is that now I attach a Dirac delta uh, onto any of these points, and then I call the empirical measure for nodes mu hat sub n, which is of course the collection of all these Dirac deltas. And I'm asking myself what happens to this Dirac measure as n tends to infinity. And what I'm demanding, this is an underlying assumption that is super important for us. This really plays a very important role. It's not just a mathematical statement, it's important. Is I'm assuming that this convergence happens weakly. Okay, so the idea is that I have a uniform measure that is like when I have this homogeneous disk that is filled by a constant, amount of neurons, if you want, like a constant density of neurons. And I have the empirical measure, and I want the two to converge weakly, which means I'm demanding that once I integrate these functions, once I integrate a function against a measure, either the n-dimensional measure or the continuous measure, the two of them are going to each other. So this is a slightly different, if you've never seen this before, the idea here is that you come up with mu sub n, you have a limit function L, a limit measure L, and what you demand is that mu n tends to L in the sense that when you integrate any function against mu n, you have to get to the integral of that function against L, so to speak. And if this doesn't make any sense for you, I think I have a visual for you later in something that you can really see at the level of patterns for later. So let's go back to the connectivity graph then for a second. I told you that this kjk can be -1, 0, and 1, but I haven't told you how I assign the probability to it. I mean, how do we assign what's the probability of -1, the probability of that node being 0, and the probability of node being 1? Well, we assume that this comes from a probability function. So you need to have a ternary probability that says that you assign a given probability measure, let's say for it being 1, for it being -1, and this defines effectively the probability of k being 0 as well. And the thing that we request, which is super important for us, is that the kjk and klm are independent with each other. So these extractions are all independent. And this is unless you're really picking the same nodes. In that case, you obviously you have the same value, is more than independent. So I was telling you earlier on that phi n is a sparsity pattern, is something that has to do with sparsity. And that is where you see that this happens. So what do we demand of n is we demand that phi n can be any sequence bigger than 0 that has a limit. This means that in the meaning of that is that on average, each neuron has n phi n non-zero connections. And the only thing we want is that n phi n goes to infinity. So ordinarily, I'm pretty sure that you have seen before works in which phi n is 1. So this means that everyone, is connected to everyone, so to speak. And now you have phi n instead. And for technical reason, now the last thing I have to tell you is about the function f. The function f is the sigmoidal firing rate, and the reason and the assumption that we make is that this f is sigmoidal, so it's bounded and globally Lipschitz, which is something that is met in any firing rate function, but it's also something that we need for Lipschitzian, we need for well-posedness of the problem. And finally, I should say a word about the Brownian motion. So this dwj, so this is like a stochastic differential equation now. And you take that as an independent Brownian motion, like you would do with any SDE. So I've been already filling you up with too many technical details, but at the moment, the way you should kind of look at this system there is just a system of stochastic differential equations, because n is finite, so that's just all well and good. And the hypotheses that we have just made are such that you have a strong solution. So far, everything I told you guarantees that there is a well-defined solution to the stochastic differential equation in the Ito sense. So if you've taken a course in stochastic differential equations, we're doing precisely that, and we are making room for we put ourselves in the simplest possible setup where the right-hand side of the drift term is Lipschitz globally, and that guarantees that this thing is the problem is well posed. Okay, so now what do we want to do? We are looking at what happens to these solutions as n tends to infinity. Remember, so I'm interested in what happens in the n infinity limit. And this is a bit technical because now, in what sense, how do I quantify this limit? What is the right gadget that lets me explore the n infinity limit? So one way, so this is what is typically done in Makin-Vlasov thing, is you construct an empirical measures. So now the idea here is that you have Dirac deltas as you used to have before, and these Dirac deltas have points, but these points are points in the solutions. So I think this is now a little bit complicated, so I want to slow down a little bit, and it would be so much easier if I had a pointer for it. So I'm actually, I think that's a good, that's a good thing to do. I really need to have that pointer. So the bottom line is this. So an empirical measure is a collection of Dirac delta. And in here, the Dirac delta are indexed by S of J. And what is S of J? Well, S of J is a trajectory, is a full orbit of the system. So the idea now is that you say, how do I quantify the overall motion here? I run the system, I come up with uj, and that is one particle. And uj, and the particle is uj across all time. So you should really think that the entire evolution of one neuron, j is fixed but time runs, the entire orbit of that neuron becomes one particle. And the empirical measure collects all these particles. And the reason why you construct this empirical measure is because that is the gadget that you can make sense of in the limit as n tends to infinity. And I'm skipping here some details. So what is the main theory that we have with James? The idea is that so I just constructed with you this empirical measure. As n tends to infinity, you have a limit. So the first thing that you just can conclude is that in the limit for infinitely many neurons, this gadget that you have created, that is the empirical measure that collects all particles, goes somewhere. And this somewhere lives in the space that you would like to be, which I do not want to get into. Uh, it's it's effectively a space where you can define moments appropriately, and it's a space, if you care for it, is the right uh, distance to look into this function space is the Wasserstein distance, but we don't. This is completely unimportant. Let's say it's a detail, and we're just working towards getting the n infinity limit, and this n infinity limit is still intractable because it's expressed in the form of an empirical measure mu t. So the idea here is that I have n neurons. As n tends to infinity, this empirical measure goes to an empirical measure for n infinity, that is mu t. But this feels a very, very abstract gadget. It's very unclear what do we do with this mu of t. And that is the next step of the theory that says that under suitable assumptions, this mu t is Gaussian. Yeah, so this is very, very crucial, and that's why we make all those simplifying assumptions at the beginning. We say not only mu t is an object that exists and we are relaxing towards it, but it can be described in terms of a Gaussian variable, and that's what drives us. So this Gaussian variable has an expectation and a variance. That's the only two things I need to describe in terms of a for a for a Gaussian variable. Once I have mean and variance, I've got everything I need. And these mean and variance, which are denoted by m and v here, they satisfy a simple neural field equations. So as I said, I'm not I mean, so it's unclear to me how much you're acquainted with this type of formalism, and perhaps you're not, and perhaps I've kind of bored you until now. But in case I've lost you and you're bored by this talk, I think you can switch on again now. The gist of the talk is the following. You start with this system of differential equations that are noise driven. And as n tend to infinity, there is a well-defined rigorous limit for these equations. And this limit looks like a neural field. So what is a neural field? Is now a situation where it's now, if you concentrate on the first variable, there is a derivative with respect to m. M is the average at position x and time t. Minus L is the minus L that was in the original microscopic variable. So what remember, this minus Lm is inherited by the minus Lu that you see in this talk. Over there, you had an integral, you had like a sum. That sum in the mean field has now become an integral, which I'll display in a second. You see there is that kernel kxy. And the only thing that has slightly changed is the firing rate. So before you had a firing rate that sees the voltage, and now you have an equivalent firing rate function that sees both mean and variance of the neural field, because this specific neural field that we found, it's evolving the mean and the variance of the variables. You also see in this mean field equation that there is I. I is an external stimulation. That is the external stimulation that appears at microscopic level in the neurons. That's the same function that you see up there. And you see that this function, in this description, there is a G. G is the noise intensity. And you also find G in the mean field. But you find it in the second equation. The second equation is the equation for the variance. And so what happens now is that in the n infinity limit, one can rigorously prove that the system is well described by this set of integral differential equation, one for the mean and one for the variance. And I think I want to take a break now, because if there are, there may be questions up until this point, and from now on, I'm going to be taking these as granted and analyze this system. So is there any question for me before I go on, or comments?
Can I ask a user level question, something
Yes,
more high
please.
level?
Yes.
So if I understand this correctly, you got a structure and you're putting in noise and you're getting a spatial pattern out. If you play with different kinds of noise, does this act as a filter for noise, literally? So you can actually detect the kind of noise that's being fed by the pattern that's coming out.
That's a great question. So I can try and answer it to you in this way. So the way if you visualize the noise as a handle, that's what you're doing is you're tinkering with this thing called G here in this slide. Yeah? Tinkering with G changes the variance of the variance of the system, which in turn changes the the mean. You see, there is like a v variable that appears up there too. So the answer I have for you is first off, noise does impact immediately, uh, does impact the pattern first, and second, in the rest of the talk, I'll show you that I can even trace that as the noise becomes bigger, I know which pattern should appear. So I
Right,
think you
that's
asked.
scaling though. But what about the type of noise, like the color of the noise or the frequency pattern of the noise or some other
Yeah.
characteristic of the noise?
So at the moment, the noise is it's entirely it's so how do I answer this? I mean, this is not a user level question. It's like a fantastic question that I think is very technical. So in here, I'm committing to a specific type of noise. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So what is this specific type of noise? So if I were to tell you white noise in space, you would, does it make sense to you? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. That's
White
what I
noise.
understood. This was my
Yeah.
question. If it is not white noise, if it is not this assumption which is theoretically convenient, then will the patterns change, or maybe that's not something you've explored yet. I don't know.
So the idea here is that at discrete level, dw is just Brownian increments, yeah? So these are Brownian increments. The dw doesn't have any color, so to speak, yeah? It's Brownian motion. But the space and the time regularity of the noise is all within the choice of the function g.
Okay.
Yeah. So for this, let's say for this limit to go through, you only require a hypothesis on G. So that is where your spatial distribution, the spatial intensity of the noise will be modeled, so to speak. But for the example I'm going to do in a second, I'm going to take G to be constant. And so this is really white noise. You
Yeah.
see? Yeah, but it doesn't have to be like that. For the
Yeah.
example I'll do, I will pick white noise.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
More questions, or shall I go on a little
So
bit? Yes.
uh, you're assuming, if I understand correctly, that all of the neurons are on a disk, topological disk when you start.
Um, that was a pictorial.
If
That was
if
a pictor. Yeah.
if they were on a sphere,
Yes. So
I didn't see any place where the topology of the neuron of where the neurons were was coming in. And I wonder if the
yes.
results are independent of the
So
topology.
so we did not. I did not make any commitment to a disk except for pictorial reason. The thing, even though I mean, I realize I conveyed this idea, but it doesn't have to be the case. So the only requirement that we make is that if D is a subset of Rn, you need to be able to define a uniform measure on this subset of Rn, and the way you distribute neurons, yeah, is simply that they have to cover this space in a weak sense. That is really all that we require.
Okay, so they could be on a sphere as well as on a disk.
Yes,
Okay,
completely.
thank you. That's it.
Now, having said that, from now on, all my examples will be on a ring. So not even a disk. They will be in a ring in R1. So why do I want to take a ring? It's very simple because once, let's say, you should think about that. So James came to us to visit, and he just started working on this. And then the idea here was, can we find the simplest possible situation in which noise intensity will drive the system through a bifurcation? And my experience is a little bit more in analyzing equations of the type you're seeing in front of you, so these neural field type equations. And so I sort of suggested to reverse engineering the problem, to reverse engineer the problem, and to come up with a situation where noise induces a Turing bifurcation. And when you are in a Turing bifurcation, the typical situation in 1D, at least in neuroscience, but also elsewhere, is that you take your cortex to be a ring. So now you're taking a ring of width 2L, you set the intensity of the forcing to 0, and that's where I'm taking constant noise intensity. GXT is now sigma. So I'm really not doing, I'm doing white noise in space, yeah? And when you are in the circles, when you're doing the Turing bifurcations for neural fields, you would typically take distance-dependent kernels. Okay, so I'm now taking a kernel that is of the type A that depends on the distance x minus y. And one that works typically well is written in front of you. It has a little bit of excitation. It has a little bit of inhibition. You'll see a picture of it in a second. And then typically, you know that playing with some of these parameters, you're bound to get Turing bifurcation in a deterministic setup. And finally, we took a sigmoidal firing rate straight from one of Jonathan Touboule's paper. Jonathan has worked pretty much these results that we are now doing in spatially extended system. Jonathan Touboule's PhD thesis was about doing precisely that, noise-induced patterns in networks of spatially independent systems. So in some sense, it was natural for us to also lift his firing rate and acknowledge his contribution. So once you put these all together, you come up with a system of equation that is like that, like the one at the bottom circled in red. And now something really special is happening. What you should see in the second equation is that the second equation is very boring. So the equation for the variance point-wise relaxes to sigma, yeah? So that looks like V should be an exponential e to the minus 2t, and it should tend towards sigma squared as t goes to infinity. So very quickly, the variant relaxes to the homogeneous solution at sigma squared. And if you now see what is happening in the first equation, when v equals sigma, is that v becomes just a parameter. And that's exactly what we do. We look for homogeneous steady states. We say, oh, the homogeneous steady states can be parametrized by sigma. I can literally say, I now take sigma as being a parameter in the first equation because I'm only looking at steady states. And we therefore can draw a set of equilibria that depends on sigma. You will see them in a moment. And we're going to use sigma as a continuation parameter. And out of it, we can compute eigenvalues of the homogeneous steady states, and we can characterize everything that we like or that we would want to wish to say about the stability of the homogeneous steady state using sigma as a parameter. So once again, this may be too abstract. So now let's just look at a little bit some concrete calculation. So at the bottom of this diagram, you see what happens to, this is a bifurcation diagram that traces equilibria of this system. So I'm looking at equilibria of this system when sigma is a parameter. And now in here, for the particular choice we have made, you see that 0, that is this horizontal line, is always a steady state of the system. So we chose the kernel and we chose the function in such a the firing rate functions in such a way that 0 is always an equilibrium for any value of sigma. But when sigma is sufficiently large, then we can predict bifurcations occurring of Turing type. So over there, when I step over T1, you can see on the left and on the right hand side that some of the eigenvalues of the linearized operator around the homogeneous steady state become unstable. And so this is what I was telling you early on, that I get that for low noise, there is no pattern, because for low noise, well, in this case, there is a pattern, but let's say the zero steady state is stable. But for sufficiently large noise, that zero steady state becomes unstable, and it gives rise to a Turing pattern. So that's the mechanism we are following there. In this particular instance that I'm drawing, you see that when sigma is 0, so there is no noise, not only do I have the homogeneous steady state, but I also have a Turing branch at the top. But there are other situations in which this will not be the case. And this is exactly what we then go and do on various systems. So we start with a system size of 128. This is now a fully stochastic problem, and we see a pattern developing. We increase n, and we still see the pattern developing. And we, of course, we can run as a benchmark the full the full mean field model in which m is a continuum, and we still see for the same values of sigma that these parameters, this bifurcation emerge. This pattern, this Turing pattern emerges. And this doesn't have to happen just for the specific case that I mentioned. In here, we had some fun with a different type of kernel. So the only thing that has changed here.
Sorry, Daniele. Can you go back
Yes.
to the slide before? I just want to get clarification. Here you're changing n.
Yes.
So what's the reason that it actually generates this very
Smooth.
deterministic-like behavior?
Yes. That's a so that's a very good point. I think you're basically a little bit so you're getting so at some point I will have had a punchline in the talk, but I think you're just basically getting me ahead of that. So perhaps when you see this picture, you think that we're getting smoother and smoother as n grows. Can you confirm that that's the feeling you have when
Yes,
you
that's
ask?
correct.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
So I will later convince you that that's not true. So in fact, what is happening here under the hood that is that as n goes to infinity, the pattern itself is not getting smoother. Even though I know that this picture here looks like n, you're getting closer and closer to a smooth pattern. So if you bear with me for 2 slides or 3, I will try to convince you of what I mean by this. I think now I don't really have a good argument yet because visually it looks like n is smoother, but that is just an effect of the interpolation figure in MATLAB. In
Okay,
a
I
moment,
see.
I'll show you actual lines, and you will see that this is not the case.
Okay,
And I will
okay, fair
explain
enough.
in what sense I will explain in what sense M is a good representative of a sample. I promise.
Sounds
Sorry that I'm slightly deflecting your question, but I think I can't just explain it yet. So let's indulge in, let's keep Anmar's question in memory, but let me say that the same thing can also happen. So I'm now showing you patterns that are Turing, so they're homogeneously, they're spread everywhere in the cortex, but that can also happen with the patterns that are localized, like this one here. In here, for instance, when sigma is 0, I have one spot. So no noise, I have one spot at the end. Slightly larger noise, I have 3 spots. Even larger noise, I have the full pattern. And this is something that also can happen and we can predict it. So I have something to say about deterministic versus random connectivity, but I will not do that. And now we'll instead address Anmar's question. So now in here, it's another instance in which you see n grows and my pattern looks smoother and smoother and smoother, at least visually. Is that the case? The answer is not, because the only thing we have in this system is not pointwise convergence, is weak convergence. So let me explain what I've done here. So in here, you've seen you can focus only on the left-hand side part of the kernel. I have run an experiment in which, let's say, in green, I have finitely many n, and in blue, there is that line of mx of t. And it's given for 2 parameters. So I think the question that Anmar is asking is related to the following. When n grows large, what happens to the green pattern? Does it get closer and closer to the blue pattern or not? And the answer is no, it doesn't. So what you're seeing here is an example on the left-hand side where I start with n equals 2 to the 9 and I run an experiment and I see some fluctuations around the blue pattern. I always plot the blue pattern for reference. Then I increase n and I'm not getting smoother, right? I'm only getting, in fact, if anything, I'm getting wider patterns, yeah? Which on average become close to the blue curve. So this mode of convergence is not a mode of convergence whereby you put more and more points and your U become closer and closer to each other. On the contrary, in here, you put more and more points and you converge pointwise nowhere. You can see here the pattern at 2 to the 20, n equals 2 to the 21. I have a bigger and bigger excursion. And that is because you're sampling a Gaussian distribution with more and more samples. And so you can get very large excursions. And the more points you have, the wider the excursions that you pick. So the mode of convergence that we have is not pointwise. Remember what I told you at the beginning about the weak convergence, yeah? So we only have weak convergence. We only have convergence once we test against functions, which means we only have convergence in mean. And in fact, what the only thing that can be said is that as you increase n, the expectation of the function will be the blue line. So I don't know if Anmar, this has helped a little bit addressing your question or not.
Yes, it does address my question, but I have another one now as a result of this.
Yeah, go ahead.
You're still assuming that the variance is constant, like homogeneous, like based on what you just talked about earlier with the
The
model.
sigma, you mean the
The
sigma?
sigma, exactly.
Yeah. Sigma is homogeneous, yes.
But aren't you showing here that it actually depends on n?
No, because in here, when I say that the variability, so when I say the variance, this is the variance of uj. So what I'm saying here is that
Oh, okay. Yes, I see.
so
Yes.
sigma is an input to the system. You fix sigma and you run this experiment for multiple n's. And what is happening is that uj is a random variable. For you change j, you're extracting a new random variable, and the variance of that grows here with n.
It's all good. Yes.
Yeah. This is really tricky. In fact, when I say that James really is, really had to teach me that, is because this discussion that I'm having with you is what I had for the whole summer to understand the mode of convergence. And in here, basically, we if you care, on the right-hand side, there is numerical evidence that the mode of convergence occurs. So what we do here is we test against sines and cosines functions, the errors, and we find out an order n to the minus a half convergence, whereby this error is measured in an integral sense, in the weak sense. So that's converging to what we expect. I think I'm almost out of time. And there's two things that I want to tell you about. The first thing is I promised you about a spiral. Where was the spiral? You now understand a little bit how this works, yeah? So the way this works is I can reverse engineer patterns now. I can say, give me a neural field, dream of a pattern, choose the kernel and the right hand side so that you expect a pattern in a standard neural field, and then you drive this neural field through some noise. That's basically the template we chose. And this is exactly the same template that we picked up for the spiral case. So over there, I went in literature. I picked up a seminal paper by Lang and others where they discuss the occurrence of spiral waves in slices. So this is like a beautiful article in which they have slices of neurons that display spirals, and they happen to see them in hexagon. So the thing that they image is a hexagon. And Carlo Lang and others, they have come up with a neural field that reproduces those spirals. So I picked that up and I then tune parameters in such a way that when there is no noise, I start with a spiral, and over time, this noise decreases. This spiral dies out. And instead, when the noise intensity is sufficiently large, then we get the spiral wave being instated, as you're seeing here. And can you imagine? I was so ambitious. I even prepared a Teletubby proof of somebody. Perhaps I thought will care about seeing the proof of that, but there is both no time and no appetite, I think, for doing that. So let me just move on. I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing now. And the bottom line is that it is clear that if we want to have any kind of hint of realism, we should bring delays into the picture. So the idea is that one thing that we want to do is to look at what happens to this system when there is delays that depend on distance, so distance dependent delays. And this is a huge problem, but effectively it turns out that it's possible to come up with a proxy for a delay and carry out the formalism that you've just done. And so soon you should see that we have one paper coming out with the first part of the talk, but soon you should see hopefully a second preprint coming out in which we discuss that we show that delays can induce oscillations with noise in this type of system. So we have the same story that you have seen before, that noise is used as as a a parameter, but in the presence of spatially dependent delay, you also get oscillations that are happening. And this is a theme that you would normally have in these type of problems, and we also find it up there. So as I said, uh, there is a preprint. So there is one paper there that you can already read on the archive. That's a paper that has been accepted on SciAm Journal of Applied Mathematics. And there is a that's the first paper that it doesn't treat delays. And then there is another one that we are getting ready now to submit again on the archive that deals with the delay case. And with this, I just want to thank you and take your questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Daniele. That's a really interesting talk. The floor is open for questions. Okay, well, maybe I'll ask my question since the people that maybe still thinking about or thinking about their own questions.
Yeah.
And we probably said this, but I just want to get a clarification. Why do you get that spatial-temporal pattern, specific temporal pattern in terms of the spirals?
Distorted.
I mean, I
This
know, I
one?
understand that it's kind of potentiated by the noise that's triggering it. By why specifically this pattern as opposed to a traveling wave or
Yes.
synchronous activity?
Yeah.
What? Yeah.
So, so I think this question is better addressed if we ask this question of a neural field in general and not of the specific problem that I have in mind. So I could cast your question as to a neural field talk to say, hey, there is a neural field that is posed on a hexagon. Why does it generate a spiral and not any of the other things that it can do, like waves or oscillations or oscillants? Yeah, and this is basically it depends on the kernel that you pick. So the kernel that I picked is such that it supports traveling waves. Yeah. But because this network has excitation and inhibition in it, so this is not a box standard neural field in which there is in each neuron there is not only just an excitatory component, but there is also an inhibitory component. One can have a translation invariance in both. It has translations both in X and Y, and that is typically a good way to start a a spiral wave. So if you can get a plane wave running, let's say, and you put inhibition, then you're in a good position to have also a spiral wave.
I
And
see.
so in this case, I really went the other way around. I selected a kernel. This kernel can generate even chaotic behavior, by the way, in the right parameter regime. but I put it in a parameter regime where I knew I was at the onset of a spiral. Yeah.
I
And
see.
then I played with sigma. I made sigma be that parameter. I don't know if this makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I get it. I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Nice.
I had to read the paper by Carlo Lang, uh, and then say, yeah, now sigma is my parameter. Yeah. But you're right. The very same kernel in slightly different region of parameter space, it can exhibit all sorts of other interesting patterns. Yeah.
I see. Leon, go ahead. You're muted.
Thanks for the talk. I'm curious about the extent to which biology is playing any role in motivating the direction you're taking, because it seems like very technical results, but I'm
Mhm.
not sure the extent to which you're thinking about biological problems. And
Mhm.
if you are thinking about real biological problems, I'd like to know which ones.
Yes. So I completely agree with you that this is a very abstract formalism for now. So I'm taking two angles here. So the first one is one angle that I have to mention. So I think these models. So this is super. I agree that this has been a very technical talk. Yeah, but and I also don't know much about your background, so I'll say this anyway. Um,
I
this
shared
model
I,
here.
I, I shared an office with you, Wilson, about 50 years
Okay,
ago.
so that's very good. So, so as good as a model as it is a Wilson, as good as a model as it is a neural mass model. So, if you think I have n masses, and I believe that these n masses are of firing rate type, that is as biological as this gets. Okay, and my take on this is that these models are phenomenological in nature, and they're very big approximations to. So there is no spiking at all. These neurons do not spike, and I'm not getting out of this. I mean, this is like. In some sense, is a limitation that comes with choosing these models to start with. So for that is point taken. Having said that, any connectomic model that you see at the moment, so any paper that discusses connectomes, they write models in this way, especially when we put delays, which is towards the end of my talk, we're getting closer to biological realism. There is one thing that I think it's really, really important that I think this thing taught me something that is important also for experiments. And it is the following. This is something I would like to pass even to an experimentalist if anyone is around. It may be that your pattern gets completely concealed by noise. So I do not know if this picture here is clear enough, but at the bottom of here, if I only showed you the green patterns, the green bit without the blue, this looks just about like a pattern, yeah, because there is enough modulation there. But if I take n large enough, this thing would become an enormous blob with variations with no patterns whatsoever. So what I'm trying to say is that sometimes people see recordings in which there seemingly is no pattern, and on average there is a pattern. That's what this theoretical implant here is saying. It's saying it may be that you observe a realization of an experiment. This experiment may seem very noisy, like the green curve is, and perhaps it can get noise to a point where you don't even detect a pattern, but there is an underlying one on average. That is the blue pattern I'm showing there. And that is something that is more portable outside of the neuroscience. So I think this is not necessarily an accurate neuroscientific model, but as a mechanism, it is applicable, for instance, to chemical oscillators, yeah, or similar systems in which perhaps the models that we use are more realistic.
Suresh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a very simple clarificatory question. It is maybe related to Anmar's. The spiral, the starting point, and the frequency of the spiral and stuff like that. Is that deterministic? Is that predictable? Like, can it go in
Yes.
different directions depending on the noise, where it happens to be start somewhere? So is it the idea that once you start somewhere, you're spiral from there with the same frequency?
So the typical results that you get, and once again, these are outside of this paper, right? This is stuff that is in the public domain about neural field and pattern formation. The general results that you have at your disposal go like that. First off, you can position the tip of the spirals anywhere you like. So now in here, things are constrained in a hexagon, but you can think of this as being on a plane. Yeah. So if you are on a domain without boundary, anywhere is a good place to position the tip of the spiral first. The frequency, the rotation frequency of the spiral is predictable. So in the same way that with a Turing pattern, I can predict the wavelength of this pattern by changing parameters. If I do a Turing analysis, one knows in principle, one knows from the Turing analysis what the wavelength of this pattern. If you do the same analysis around a homogeneous steady state, and these homogeneous steady states give rise to a spiral wave, then you have an emerging frequency of oscillation because you have Hopf eigenvalues that cross, and from the Hopf eigenvalues that cross, you can detect the frequencies of the oscillations.
Yeah, the reason I was asking is because in your case it's noise driven. So I was wondering if that stochasticity then you somehow, for example, on one trial, then the noise may have a peak in one place and or the other. So is it somehow related to your input in a way that you can say
So
something?
So in this situation, you would say first off, sigma is homogeneous everywhere. It's not spatially dependent, but I can have different levels of sigma. And I would expect that different levels of sigma give rise to different speeds of the spiral wave. The different
That's just,
rotation
yeah,
speeds of that is absolutely correct.
yeah. Okay, thank you. Perfect. Thank
Yeah.
you.
But let's say when it comes to location, that is more nuanced because I was trying to say that these analyses lets you place the tip of the spiral, lets you translate the spiral upwards and downwards and by any amounts, left, right, and center as much as you like, provided your domain is infinite.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other question? Okay, let's thank our speaker again, Daniele. So well done. That was really interesting, and
Thank
I
you.
guess hopefully.